I never thought my life would come crashing down in the span of a single afternoon, but that's exactly what happened on that fateful day in June. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling grounds of our Bel Air mansion, a place I once considered a sanctuary. Now, it felt more like a battlefield. It had all started with an argument, one that escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. My husband, Lucas, stood in the grand living room, his mother, Helena, by his side. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. I could see the disdain in Helena's sharp eyes, a look I'd grown accustomed to over the years of our tumultuous relationship. "You have two choices," Lucas said, his voice cold and detached. It was a tone I'd never heard him use before, at least not directed at me. "Either you hand over this house to my mother, or you'll have nowhere to live." The authority in his voice was unmistakable, as if he had already won the battle in his mind. I stared at him, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it echoing off the vaulted ceilings. But I'd learned long ago that in moments like these, composure was my greatest ally. I kept my expression neutral, years of dealing with high society events and cutthroat business dinners coming in handy. "Lucas," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "this is our home. We built this life together. Why would you want to give it away?" I tried to appeal to the man I thought I knew, the one I'd fallen in love with all those years ago at Stanford. He scoffed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "This isn't about us anymore, Sarah. It's about family loyalty. Mom needs a place befitting her status, and this house is perfect." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "And what about our status? Our life here?" Helena chose that moment to chime in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Oh, darling, surely you understand. Family comes first, doesn't it? And you're part of this family now, aren't you?" The way she said it made my skin crawl. I'd never felt like part of their family, not really. They'd always seen me as an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit into their world of old money and older prejudices. "I understand family loyalty," I said carefully, "but this feels more like betrayal." Lucas's eyes flashed dangerously. "Betrayal? You want to talk about betrayal?" He stepped closer, his 6 feet 2 inches frame towering over me. "How about the way you've been running my company into the ground with your progressive ideas?" I blinked, taken aback. "Your company? Lucas, we built that company together. And those progressive ideas have doubled our profits in the last quarter alone." He waved his hand dismissively. "Numbers on a page. What about our reputation? Our standing in the community?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was this really about the company, or was it just an excuse? I looked from Lucas to Helena, trying to make sense of this sudden upheaval in my life. "If this is about the company," I said slowly, "we can discuss this rationally. There's no need to bring our home into it." Helena let out a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Oh, you naive girl. This isn't just about the company. This is about putting you in your place." The words hit me like a slap. I'd always known Helena disliked me, but I never thought she'd be so blatant about it. "And Lucas?" I looked at my husband, searching for any sign of the man I married, but all I saw was a stranger with cold eyes and a set jaw. "My place," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas nodded, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "Yes, your place. You've gotten too comfortable, too confident. It's time you remembered who's really in charge here." I felt as if the ground was shifting beneath my feet. This wasn't just about the house or the company. This was about control, about power. They wanted to strip me of everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built. "And if I refuse?" I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. Lucas's smile widened, and in that moment, he looked so much like his mother that it chilled me to the bone. "Then you'll have nothing. No home, no company, no status. You'll be right back where you started, a nobody from a nowhere town in Oregon." The words stung, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I squared my shoulders and met his gaze head-on. "Is that your final decision?" For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He nodded once, sharply. "It is." I took a deep breath, weighing my options. I could fight, could remind him of our years together, of the love we once shared. But looking at him now, standing there with his mother, I realized that the man I loved was long gone. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If that's how you want it." Lucas seemed taken aback by my acquiescence, but he recovered quickly. He turned to Helena, who was watching the scene unfold with poorly concealed glee. "Mom, why don't you start making plans for the renovations? I'm sure Sarah won't mind moving her things out quickly." I watched as Helena's face lit up like a child on Christmas morning. She began rattling off ideas for changes, each one a dagger to my heart. This house, every inch of it, held memories. The kitchen where Lucas and I had spent countless evenings cooking together, the study where we'd worked side by side building our company from the ground up, the bedroom where we'd talked about our dreams for the future. And now, in the span of an afternoon, it was all being torn away. As Helena prattled on about color schemes and furniture arrangements, Lucas turned back to me, his expression a mixture of triumph and something else. Was it regret? Doubt? Whatever it was quickly masked by a look of cool indifference. "You have until the end of the week to move out," he said, his tone businesslike. "Anything left behind will be disposed of." I nodded mutely, still trying to process the enormity of what was happening. End of the week. 5 days to pack up a decade of my life. As if reading my thoughts, Lucas's lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, and Sarah? Don't bother trying to take anything valuable. We'll be doing a thorough inventory." The implication was clear. They thought I might try to steal from them. As if I hadn't earned every single thing in this house through years of hard work and dedication. I was about to respond when a commotion outside caught our attention. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see a line of trucks pulling up the driveway. My blood ran cold as I recognized the logo on their sides, a local demolition company. "Lucas," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm, "what is this?" He followed my gaze, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. But when he turned back to me, his expression was hard as stone. "Insurance," he said simply. "Insurance," I repeated, not understanding. He sighed, as if explaining something to a child. "To make sure you understand the gravity of the situation. You see, Sarah, I know you. I know how stubborn you can be, how you like to think you can outsmart everyone. So I'm making sure you don't have any room to maneuver." As he spoke, men in hard hats began to file out of the trucks, carrying equipment that made my stomach churn. This wasn't just about moving out anymore. This was destruction. "You can't be serious," I whispered, watching as the men began to set up around the perimeter of the house. Lucas's expression didn't change. "Oh, I'm very serious. You have 2 choices," he repeated his earlier ultimatum. "Either you hand over this house to my mother right now, signing whatever documents we put in front of you, or you'll have nowhere to live. Because if you don't cooperate, I'll have them start demolition right here, right now." I stared at him, disbelief warring with a growing sense of horror. This was madness. Surely he wouldn't actually go through with it. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw no trace of the man I had married. This was someone else entirely, someone cruel and cold. "You'd destroy our home?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of equipment being readied outside. He shrugged, the gesture so casual it made my blood boil. "It's not our home anymore. It's just a house. And sometimes, you have to tear things down to build them back up better." I looked from Lucas to Helena, who was watching the scene unfold with poorly disguised glee, to the workers outside, poised to bring my world crashing down around me. In that moment, I realized that this was it. The point of no return. Whatever I decided now would shape the course of my future. Time seemed to slow as I weighed my options. I could give in, sign whatever they put in front of me, and walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back. Or I could stand my ground and watch as they literally tore my life apart. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. I met Lucas's gaze, summoning every ounce of strength I had left. "Do it," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. For a moment, surprise flickered across his face. Clearly, he hadn't expected me to call his bluff, if it was a bluff at all. But he recovered quickly, his expression hardening once more. "You're sure about this?" he asked, giving me one last chance to back down. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Lucas held my gaze for a long moment before turning to the window. With a sharp nod to the foreman outside, he gave the order for the demolition crew to begin. The sound of the first impact was deafening. I watched, my heart breaking, as cracks splintered through the walls of my once pristine home. Each blow felt like it was striking me personally, tearing away pieces of my life, my memories, my future. As dust began to fill the air, Lucas turned back to me, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "Well, it seems you've made your choice," he said, his voice barely audible over the chaos outside. "I hope you're prepared to live with the consequences." I stood there, silent and still, as my world quite literally crumbled around me. Lucas watched me for a moment longer, perhaps waiting for me to break down, to beg him to stop. But I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Finally, he turned away, gesturing for Helena to follow him. As they made their way to the door, he paused, looking back at me one last time. "Now you live under our roof, under our rules," he sneered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. And with that, they were gone, leaving me alone in the ruins of the life I had built. As I stood there, surrounded by the destruction of everything I held dear, I felt something shift inside me. The shock and disbelief began to give way to something else, a quiet, simmering anger. An anger that would fuel what was to come. Because what Lucas and Helena didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that they hadn't broken me. They had simply set me free. As the dust settled around me, both literally and figuratively, I found myself at a crossroads. The remnants of my home lay scattered at my feet, a stark reminder of how quickly life can change. I had every reason to break down, to beg, to argue. But instead, I felt an eerie calm wash over me. It was as if the destruction of my physical world had sharpened my inner resolve. Lucas and Helena stood a few feet away, their expressions a mix of triumph and anticipation. They were waiting for me to crumble, to fall to my knees and plead for mercy. But I had no intention of giving them that satisfaction. Instead, I simply met Lucas's gaze and said one word, "Okay." It was a quiet, calm response that made both him and his mother narrow their eyes in suspicion. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of debris settling. Helena was the first to recover. She scoffed, her perfectly manicured hand waving dismissively in the air. "That's it. After all this, you just say okay?" Her voice dripped with disdain, but I could hear the undercurrent of uncertainty. I shrugged, the gesture so casual it seemed to unsettle them even more. "What else is there to say?" I asked, my voice steady. "You've made your decision. You've quite literally brought the house down. What good would arguing do now?" Lucas stared at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. This wasn't the reaction he had expected, and I could see him struggling to regain his footing in this unexpected turn of events. "Well," he said finally, a hint of his earlier bravado returning, "I'm glad you've finally seen reason. It's about time you understood your place in this family." I almost laughed at that. Family. The word had lost all meaning in the span of an afternoon. But I kept my face neutral, years of boardroom negotiations coming in handy. "Of course," I said, my tone pleasant but devoid of any real emotion. "So, what happens now?" Lucas seemed to relax slightly, clearly thinking he had one. "Now, you come with us. You'll stay at the family estate until we decide what to do with you." The way he said it, as if I were a piece of furniture to be moved at will, should have angered me. But I felt oddly detached, as if I were watching this scene play out from a distance. "Fine," I said, nodding. "Let me grab my purse, and we can go." As I turned to retrieve my bag from the rubble, I caught a glimpse of myself in a cracked mirror that had somehow survived the demolition. The woman staring back at me was someone I barely recognized. Her eyes were clear and determined, her posture straight and proud. This wasn't the broken, defeated woman Lucas and Helena had expected to see. This was someone else entirely. I allowed myself a small smile as I picked up my purse. Let them think they had one. Let them believe they had broken me. They had no idea what was coming. When I returned, Lucas was on the phone, barking orders to someone about cleaning up the mess. Helena was surveying the destruction with a look of smug satisfaction on her face. Neither of them paid much attention to me as Lucas grabbed my arm and pulled me toward his car. The drive to their estate was steeped in self-satisfied silence on his part. Helena had opted to take her own car, probably to start planning her renovations of my former home. As we wound our way through the hills of Bel Air, I merely stared out the window, watching as my past was reduced to rubble behind me. Lucas seemed to take my silence as defeat. Every now and then, I'd catch him glancing at me, a small smirk playing at his lips. He thought he had one, that he had finally put me in my place. Little did he know, he had just set in motion a series of events that would change everything. As we drove, my mind raced with possibilities. I had always been the planner in our relationship, the one who thought 10 steps ahead. It was a skill that had served me well in business, and now, it would serve me in ways Lucas couldn't begin to imagine. I thought about the connections I had made over the years, the favors I could call in. I thought about the quiet moves I had made, the safeguards I had put in place. Lucas had always underestimated me, had always seen me as just a pretty face to stand beside him at social events. He had no idea of the network I had built, the power I had accumulated in my own right. By the time we arrived at the gates of the Grand family estate, a place I had rarely visited due to my strained relationship with Helena, the air had grown heavier. Lucas seemed gleeful, certain that he had established dominance. But he had no idea what awaited him. As we pulled up to the imposing mansion, I allowed myself a moment to take it all in. The Alencar family estate was a monument to old money and older traditions. Its sprawling grounds and neoclassical architecture spoke of a family that valued appearance above all else. It was a stark contrast to the warm, modern home Lucas and I had built together, the home that now lay in ruins. Lucas parked the car and turned to me, his expression a mixture of triumph and condescension. "Welcome home," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I hope you'll find your accommodations suitable." I didn't respond, simply unbuckling my seatbelt and stepping out of the car. The gravel crunched under my feet as I made my way to the front door, Lucas close behind me. As we approached, I noticed something that made me pause. Standing at the entrance were 6 men, dressed in sharp, tailored suits. Their imposing figures cast long shadows under the dim porch light, and there was something about their stance that spoke of barely contained power. Lucas noticed them too, and I heard him let out a confused laugh. "What's this?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Mother throwing a welcome party?" But as we got closer, I saw his bravado waver. The men took a step forward in unison, their movements synchronized and purposeful. It was clear they weren't here for a social call. I stepped out in front, my demeanor unchanged. One of the men, a tall, distinguished-looking gentleman with salt and pepper hair, tilted his head slightly. A thin smirk played at his lips as his eyes met mine. "Mrs. Alencar," he said politely, ignoring Lucas entirely. "As per your instructions, everything is in place. Would you like to proceed?" His voice was smooth and professional, carrying an undertone of something much colder. I recognized him immediately, Richard, an old acquaintance I hadn't needed to call on in years. But I had always kept his number, just in case. Lucas's face paled, his earlier confidence evaporating in an instant. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "what the hell is going on?" I turned to him then, allowing myself to smile for the first time since this ordeal began. It wasn't a warm smile, or even a triumphant one. It was the smile of someone who had been holding their cards close to their chest, waiting for the perfect moment to lay them all out. "What's going on, Lucas?" I said, my voice calm and steady, "is that you made a grave miscalculation. You thought you could strip me of everything, that you could leave me with nothing. But you forgot one very important thing." I paused, savoring the moment as realization began to dawn on his face. "You forgot who I am. You forgot what I'm capable of." Lucas took a step back, his eyes darting between me and the men in suits. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What have you done?" I laughed then, a sound devoid of any real humor. "I haven't done anything, Lucas. Not yet. But you've done plenty. You've shown your true colors, and in doing so, You've given me everything I need to take back what's mine." As if on cue, the front door of the mansion opened, and Helena emerged. Her triumphant expression quickly turned to one of confusion and then fear as she took in the scene before her. "Lucas," she called out, her voice shrill with panic. "What's happening? Who are these men?" Lucas didn't answer, his eyes still fixed on me. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out how he had lost control of the situation so quickly. I turned back to Richard, nodding slightly. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and confident. "I think it's time we proceeded. After all, we have a lot to discuss, don't we, Lucas?" As Richard and his men moved forward, surrounding Lucas and Helena, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The silent response I had given earlier wasn't one of defeat, it was the calm before the storm. And now, that storm was about to break. Lucas and Helena's world was about to come crashing down, just as they had done to mine. But unlike them, I wasn't acting out of spite or a desire for control. This was about justice, about setting things right. As we all moved into the mansion, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats, I couldn't help but think about how we had arrived at this point. How a marriage that had once seemed so full of promise had devolved into this power play. But those were thoughts for another time. Right now, I had a future to reclaim, and a past to put firmly behind me. The silent response was over. Now, it was time for action. As we stepped into the grand foyer of the Alencar family estate, the tension in the air was palpable. The opulent surroundings, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, seemed to mock the chaos unfolding within its walls. Lucas and Helena stood rigid, their earlier bravado replaced by a growing sense of unease. Richard, ever the professional, cleared his throat softly. "Perhaps we should move this discussion to a more private setting," he suggested, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lucas, seemingly jolted out of his stunned silence, puffed up his chest in a last-ditch attempt at authority. "Now wait just a minute," he blustered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This is my house, and I demand to know what's going on." I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Just hours ago, he had been the one making demands, tearing down our home without a second thought. How quickly the tables had turned. "Of course, Lucas," I said, my voice dripping with false sweetness. "We'll explain everything. But first, why don't we all get comfortable? I'm sure your study will suffice." Without waiting for a response, I started towards the familiar oak doors at the end of the hall. I had only been in Lucas's study a handful of times over the years. It had always been his sanctuary, his place to retreat from the world. Now, it would be the stage for his undoing. As we filed into the room, I couldn't help but notice how nothing had changed. The same leather-bound books lined the shelves, the same expensive scotch sat on the sideboard. It was as if time had stood still in this room, even as the world outside had shifted dramatically. Lucas immediately moved behind his massive mahogany desk, as if the physical barrier could protect him from what was to come. Helena perched on the edge of a nearby armchair, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the rich fabric. Richard and his men positioned themselves strategically around the room, their presence a silent reminder of the power shift that had occurred. I took a seat directly across from Lucas, meeting his gaze steadily. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I had married. Confused, vulnerable, maybe even a little scared. But it was quickly replaced by a hardness that I had become all too familiar with in recent years. "All right, Sarah," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You've had your fun. Now tell me what this is all about." I leaned back in my chair, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. How do you explain to someone that their entire world is about to come crashing down? That everything they thought they knew was built on a foundation of lies and misconceptions? "Do you remember when we first met, Lucas?" I asked, my voice soft with nostalgia. "We were both so young, so full of dreams and ambition. You were going to change the world, and I was going to be right there beside you." Lucas's brow furrowed in confusion. Clearly, this wasn't the explanation he had been expecting. "What does that have to do with anything?" he snapped. I held up a hand, silencing him. "It has everything to do with this, Lucas. Because somewhere along the way, you forgot who I was. You forgot that I wasn't just your wife, or your partner. I was my own person, with my own dreams, my own ambitions. I paused, letting my words sink in. And while you were busy playing the big shot, throwing your weight around and making grand gestures, I was working. I was planning. I was building something that you couldn't even begin to comprehend. Helena let out a derisive snort from her corner. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "What could you possibly have built that we don't know about? You're nothing without this family, nothing without my son." I turned to her, my smile cold. "That's where you're wrong, Helena. I'm everything without this family. And I'm about to prove it." With a nod to Richard, I watched as he produced a thick envelope from his briefcase. He handed it to me with a slight bow, and I couldn't help but savor the moment as I flipped through the documents inside. "You see, Lucas," I said, my voice steady and clear, "while you were busy playing games, I was making moves. Real moves. The kind that change lives and fortunes." I pulled out a series of papers, laying them on the desk in front of Lucas. "Do you recognize these?" I asked, even though I knew he wouldn't. "These are the ownership documents for Alencar Industries. Your family's company. The company you thought you controlled." Lucas's face paled as he scanned the documents, his hands shaking slightly as he picked them up for a closer look. This can't be right," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "These say that I own controlling interest in the company." I finished for him. "Yes, they do. Have for years, actually. It's amazing what you can accomplish when no one's paying attention to you." Helena let out a strangled gasp, finally grasping the gravity of the situation. "Lucas," she hissed, her voice thick with panic, "what is she talking about? Tell me this isn't true." But Lucas couldn't respond. He was too busy rifling through the papers, his face growing paler with each passing second. I leaned forward, my voice low and intense. "It's not just the company, Lucas. It's everything. The houses, the cars, the bank accounts. Even this estate. Legally, they were never yours to begin with." The silence that followed was deafening. I could almost hear the gears turning in Lucas's head as he tried to process this information, tried to find a way out of the trap he had unwittingly walked into. "How?" he finally managed to croak out. "How is this possible?" I sat back, a small, sad smile playing at my lips. "It's amazing what people will overlook when they underestimate you. All those times you sent me to handle the paperwork or take care of the details. I was doing exactly that. Just not in the way you imagined." I turned to Helena, whose face had gone from shock to fury. "And you, Helena. All those snide comments about my background, my lack of breeding. Did it ever occur to you that maybe, just maybe, I was more than what you saw on the surface?" Helena's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For once in her life, she was speechless. I stood up then, smoothing down my skirt as I did so. "I never wanted it to come to this," I said, my voice softening slightly. "All I ever wanted was to be your partner, Lucas. Your equal. But you couldn't see past your own ego, your own need for control." Lucas slumped in his chair, the fight seemingly gone out of him. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in years. I saw the lines of stress around his eyes, the grey at his temples that hadn't been there when we first met. For a moment, I felt a pang of regret for what might have been. But then I remembered the sound of our home being demolished, the cruel smile on his face as he thought he had one. And I steeled myself for what needed to be done. "Now," I said, my voice firm but not unkind, "you have a choice to make. You can fight this, drag it out in court, make a spectacle of yourselves. Or you can accept that things have changed, and we can work out an arrangement that's fair to everyone." Helena let out a bitter laugh. "Fair? You call this fair? You've stolen everything from us." I turned to her, my patience wearing thin. "I haven't stolen anything, Helena. I've simply taken back what was rightfully mine. What I earned through years of hard work and dedication while you two were busy playing games." I turned back to Lucas, who was staring at the papers in front of him as if they held the secrets of the universe. "The ball's in your court, Lucas. What's it going to be?" For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, counting down the seconds of this pivotal moment. Finally, Lucas looked up at me. His eyes were tired, defeated, but there was something else there too. A glimmer of respect. Understanding. I couldn't quite place it. "You always were smarter than I gave you credit for," he said softly. "I just never wanted to admit it." I nodded, acknowledging the compliment for what it was, a white flag, a surrender. "So what now?" he asked, his voice stronger now. "Where do we go from here?" I smiled then, a genuine smile this time. "Now, we negotiate. Like the business partners we should have been all along." As Richard stepped forward with another set of documents, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. The hardest part was over. The truth was out. Now came the task of rebuilding, not just the company, but perhaps, in time, relationships as well. The unexpected visit had changed everything. But as I looked around the room at the shocked faces of Lucas and Helena, at the proud smile playing at Richard's lips, I knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter was starting, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The study fell into an uneasy silence as Lucas's words hung in the air. The gravity of the situation seemed to press down on all of us, the tick of the antique clock on the mantel marking each passing second with painful clarity. I watched as Lucas's face cycled through a range of emotions, disbelief, anger, and finally, a resigned acceptance. Helena, however, was not ready to concede. She sprang from her chair, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "This is preposterous," she spat, her voice shrill with panic. "Lucas, you can't seriously be considering negotiating with her. She's bluffing, she has to be." I turned to Helena, my patience wearing thin. "I assure you, Helena, this is no bluff. Every document here is legal and binding. You're welcome to have your lawyers look them over, but I can guarantee they'll find everything in order." Richard stepped forward, his presence a calming influence in the charged atmosphere. "If I may," he interjected smoothly, "I have prepared a comprehensive overview of Mrs. Alencar's holdings and the current state of Alencar Industries. Perhaps this would help clarify the situation for everyone." I nodded my assent, and Richard began distributing folders to Lucas and Helena. As they flipped through the pages, their faces grew increasingly pale. The truth, laid out in black and white, was undeniable. Lucas looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and grudging admiration. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you manage all this without me knowing?" I couldn't help but let out a small, humorless laugh. "It wasn't as difficult as you might think, Lucas. You were so convinced of your own superiority, so certain that I was just the pretty face by your side, that you never bothered to look closely at what I was doing." I stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the manicured gardens of the estate. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. It felt symbolic somehow, the end of one era and the beginning of another. "Do you remember when we first started the company?" I asked, my voice soft with nostalgia. "We were so young, so full of dreams and ambition. We promised each other that we'd be partners in everything, equals in business and in life." I turned back to face Lucas, my expression hardening. "But somewhere along the way, you forgot that promise. You started making decisions without consulting me, dismissing my ideas, treating me like I was just another employee rather than your partner." Lucas had the grace to look ashamed, his eyes dropping to the documents in front of him. I didn't realize," he muttered. "No, you didn't," I agreed. "And that was your biggest mistake. While you were busy playing the big shot CEO, I was learning. I was watching. I was making connections and building relationships that you never even knew about." I walked back to the desk, picking up one of the documents. "This takeover didn't happen overnight, Lucas. It's been years in the making. Every time you sent me to handle the paperwork or take care of the details, I was laying the groundwork for this moment." Helena, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly found her voice. "But why?" she demanded. "Why go to all this trouble? Why not just leave if you were so unhappy?" I turned to her, my expression softening slightly. "Because this company, this life we've built, it means something to me. I've poured my heart and soul into Alencar Industries. I couldn't just walk away and let it be run into the ground by someone who cared more about his ego than the business. I looked back at Lucas, who was watching me with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. I tried to talk to you, Lucas. So many times. I tried to show you that your decisions were hurting the company, that we needed to adapt to survive. But you wouldn't listen. You were too convinced of your own infallibility. Lucas nodded slowly, the truth of my words seemingly sinking in. The new marketing strategy, he murmured. The expansion into sustainable tech. The partnerships with those startups. That was all you, wasn't it? I nodded. It was. And look at the results, Lucas. Our profits have doubled in the last quarter alone. The company is stronger than it's ever been. Helena scoffed, her disdain evident. So what, you expect us to thank you? To be grateful that you've stolen everything from us? I whirled on her, my patience finally snapping. I haven't stolen anything, Helena. I've saved this company from your son's mismanagement and your family's outdated ideas. Everything I've done has been completely legal and above board. If anyone should be grateful, it's you too. The room fell silent again, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Lucas looked shell-shocked, as if he was seeing me for the first time. Helena's face was a mask of barely contained fury. Richard cleared his throat softly. Perhaps, he suggested, this would be a good time to discuss the terms of the new arrangement. Mrs. Alencar has prepared a very generous offer for you both. I nodded, grateful for the interruption. Yes, let's talk about moving forward. Because despite everything, I don't want to see you two left with nothing. That was never my intention. I pulled out another set of documents from the folder Richard had given me earlier. I'm prepared to offer you both a sizable settlement and ongoing shares in the company. You'll be taken care of for life, and you'll still benefit from the company's success. All I ask in return is that you step down from your positions and allow me to take full control of Alencar Industries. Lucas's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. You'd do that? After everything that's happened today, you'd still offer us a way out? I met his gaze steadily. Despite everything, Lucas, we were partners once. We built this company together. I won't forget that, even if you did. Helena let out a bitter laugh. And what choice do we have? You hold all the cards. We have to take whatever scraps you're willing to throw our way. I turned to her, my expression hardening. You're right, Helena. I do hold all the cards. And if I wanted to, I could leave you both with nothing. But that's not who I am. That's not how I do business. I'm offering you a chance to walk away from this with your dignity and your financial security intact. I suggest you think very carefully before you dismiss it. The room fell silent once more as Lucas and Helena exchanged glances. I could almost see the wheels turning in their heads as they weighed their options. Finally, Lucas spoke. Can we have some time to look over these documents? To consult with our lawyers? I nodded, relief washing over me. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. Of course. Take all the time you need. Richard will be available to answer any questions you might have. As Richard began gathering the documents to hand over to Lucas and Helena, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth was out. The cards were on the table. Whatever happened next, I knew I had done everything I could to set things right. I moved towards the door, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. As I reached for the handle, Lucas's voice stopped me. Sarah, he said, his tone softer than I'd heard it in years. I'm sorry. For everything. I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that. I turned back to him, taking in the man I had once loved so deeply. In that moment, I saw a glimmer of the person I had married, humbled, vulnerable, but with a spark of the determination that had first drawn me to him. I know, Lucas, I said quietly. And I'm sorry too. Sorry that it had to come to this. With that, I stepped out of the study, leaving Lucas and Helena to grapple with the new reality I had presented them. As I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking on the marble floor, I felt a strange mix of emotions wash over me: relief, sadness, and a quiet sense of triumph. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. But as I looked ahead to the future, a future where I would be in control of my own destiny, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The truth had set me free, and now it was time to build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. As I closed the study door behind me, the weight of what had just transpired settled heavily on my shoulders. The hallway stretched before me, its opulent decor now seeming more like a facade than ever before. I took a deep breath, steadying myself against the ornate wallpaper, and allowed myself a moment to process the whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. Inside the study, I could hear muffled voices rising and falling in heated discussion. Lucas and Helena were no doubt grappling with the shocking revelations I had just dropped on them. Part of me wanted to press my ear to the door, to hear their unfiltered reactions, but I resisted the urge. I had said my piece, now it was up to them to decide how to move forward. I made my way down the hallway, my heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The sound echoed in the empty space, a reminder of how alone I truly was in this moment. As I reached the grand staircase, I paused, looking up at the family portraits that lined the wall. Generations of Alenkars stared down at me, their painted eyes seeming to judge my actions. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Had I gone too far? Was this elaborate plan truly necessary? But then I remembered the cruel smile on Lucas's face as he ordered the demolition of our home, the years of condescension and dismissal from Helena. My resolve strengthened. I had done what was necessary to protect myself and the company we had built. I was about to descend the stairs when I heard the study door burst open. Helena's voice, shrill with panic, echoed down the hallway. "Lucas, this isn't true, is it? Tell me this is all some horrible mistake." I turned, watching as Helena practically dragged Lucas out of the study. His face was ashen, the documents I had given them clutched tightly in his trembling hands. For a moment, our eyes met across the distance. I saw a myriad of emotions flash across his face: disbelief, anger, and finally, a crushing realization of the truth. Helena spotted me then, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of fury and desperation. "You," she spat, pointing an accusing finger in my direction. "What have you done? How dare you try to steal what rightfully belongs to this family?" I stood my ground, meeting her gaze steadily. "I haven't stolen anything, Helena. Everything I've done has been completely legal. If you don't believe me, I suggest you have your lawyers look over those documents very carefully." Lucas let out a strangled gasp, reaching for her arm. "Mom, she's right. I've looked at the paperwork. It's all legitimate. She owns everything." Helena let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. "No, that's impossible. You're the CEO, Lucas. This is your company, your legacy." I couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for her. Despite her years of cruelty towards me, I knew this moment must be devastating. "Helena," I said, my voice softer now, "I know this is a shock. But the company is in good hands. I've been running it behind the scenes for years now. Nothing will change, except that now it will be official." Lucas slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. "How did I not see this coming?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "All those times I dismissed your ideas, sent you to handle the little details. I was handing you the keys to the kingdom, wasn't I?" I descended the stairs slowly, approaching them with caution. "Lucas, I never wanted it to come to this. All I ever wanted was to be your true partner, in business and in life. But you pushed me aside, made me feel small and insignificant. I had to protect myself, and the company." Helena whirled on Lucas, her eyes flashing with anger. "This is your fault," she hissed. "If you had just listened to me, if you had kept her in her place, none of this would have happened." I watched as Lucas flinched at his mother's words, seeing perhaps for the first time the toxic influence she had always had over him. "No, Mom," he said quietly, his voice filled with a newfound clarity. "This is my fault, but not for the reasons you think. I should have valued Sarah, should have seen her for the incredible partner she is. Instead, I let my ego and your outdated ideas cloud my judgment. Helena let out a strangled gasp, reaching for the wall to steady herself. Lucas, this isn't true, is it? You can't possibly be taking her side. But Lucas wasn't listening to her anymore. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and dawning understanding. I've been such a fool, Sarah. Can you ever forgive me? I felt my breath catch in my throat. This was a moment I had imagined countless times, but now that it was here, I found myself at a loss for words. Lucas, I began, my voice trembling slightly, forgiveness is a long road. We can't undo years of hurt overnight. But I'm willing to try if you are. Helena let out a wail of despair, sinking to her knees beside Lucas. This can't be happening, she moaned. We can't lose everything. We're Alankars. We're better than this. I knelt down beside them, my heart heavy with the weight of the moment. You haven't lost everything, I said gently. I meant what I said about the settlement. You'll both be taken care of. And Lucas, if you're willing to work with me instead of against me, there's still a place for you in the company. Lucas looked up at me, hope flickering in his eyes. You'd give me a second chance. After everything I've done? I nodded slowly. It won't be easy. We'll need to rebuild trust, redefine our roles. But yes, I'm willing to try if you are. Helena's head snapped up, her eyes wild with a mixture of fear and desperation. No, she cried. Lucas, don't listen to her. She's trying to trick you, to manipulate you. We can fight this. We can take her to court, expose her for the fraud she is. But Lucas wasn't listening. He was staring at me with a newfound respect, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. No, Mom, he said firmly. No more fighting. No more games. Sarah's right. It's time we started working together instead of against each other. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This was more than I had dared to hope for when I set this plan in motion. Thank you, Lucas, I said softly. I think this could be a new beginning for all of us, if we're willing to put in the work. Helena let out a bitter laugh. A new beginning? You've destroyed everything. Our family, our legacy, our reputation, it's all gone. I turned to her, my patience wearing thin. Nothing is destroyed, Helena. The company is stronger than ever. Your family's legacy is secure. The only thing that's gone is your illusion of control. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. Lucas struggled to his feet, reaching out a hand to help his mother up. She's right, Mom. We need to accept this new reality. Fighting it will only make things worse. Helena looked from Lucas to me, her face a mask of confusion and betrayal. I don't understand, she whispered. How can you both be so calm about this? How can you just accept it? I stood up, smoothing down my skirt. Because sometimes, Helena, accepting change is the only way to move forward. The world is different now. The old ways of doing business, of running a family, they don't work anymore. It's time for something new. Lucas nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. I think I'm starting to see that now. Sarah, I owe you an apology. Many apologies, actually. I've been blind for so long, but I'm ready to open my eyes. I felt a lump form in my throat. This was the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. Humble, open-minded, ready to learn and grow. Thank you, Lucas, I said softly. That means more than you know. Helena looked between us, her expression one of utter defeat. So that's it then, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything changes, just like that. I shook my head. Not everything, Helena. The important things, family, legacy, the work we do, those remain. They just might look a little different now. As we stood there in the hallway, the weight of everything that had happened settling around us, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future. It wouldn't be easy, there were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were on the right path. The collapse of the old order had been necessary, painful as it was. But from the rubble, something new and potentially beautiful could grow. It was up to us now to nurture it, to build something stronger and more equitable than what had come before. As I looked at Lucas and Helena, I saw the first tentative steps towards acceptance. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but I was ready to face it. We all were. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. The following days passed in a blur of meetings, legal consultations, and tense negotiations. The Grand Alencar mansion, once a symbol of unwavering power and prestige, now felt like a chessboard where the final moves of a long game were being played out. The air was thick with a mixture of resignation, hope, and lingering resentment. I found myself spending long hours in Lucas's study, now our shared workspace, poring over documents and hammering out the details of the new arrangement. Lucas, to his credit, threw himself into the process with a determination I hadn't seen in years. It was as if the shock of recent events had jolted him out of a long slumber, awakening the sharp, innovative mind that had first drawn me to him. "What if we restructured the board like this?" he suggested one evening, sliding a notepad across the desk to me. I leaned in, studying his neat handwriting and detailed organizational chart. "This could work," I said slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "It maintains the balance of power we discussed, but also creates new opportunities for growth." "I'm impressed, Lucas." He shrugged, but I could see the pleased glint in his eyes. "I've had a lot of time to think lately. About the company, about us, about everything, really." I nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. "And what conclusions have you come to?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the family portrait hanging on the wall behind me. "That I've been a fool," he said softly. "That I let my ego and my mother's influence blind me to what was really important. I forgot that we were supposed to be partners, Sarah. In every sense of the word." I felt a lump form in my throat. This was the Lucas I had fallen in love with, thoughtful, introspective, willing to admit his mistakes. "It's not too late to change that," I offered cautiously. He turned back to me, a sad smile playing on his lips. "No, it's not. But we have a long way to go, don't we?" I nodded, appreciating his honesty. "We do. But I think we're on the right path now." Our conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Richard entered, his usual composed demeanor slightly ruffled. "Mrs. Alencar, Mr. Alencar," he greeted us with a nod. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. It's about Helena." I felt my stomach drop. Helena had been conspicuously absent from our negotiations, holed up in her wing of the mansion. I had hoped she was coming to terms with the new reality, but Richard's expression told me otherwise. "What's happened?" Lucas asked, concern etching lines on his face. Richard cleared his throat. "It appears that Mrs. Helena has been in contact with some, shall we say, less than reputable individuals. She's attempting to challenge the legality of the takeover." I exchanged a worried glance with Lucas. This was exactly the kind of desperate move I had feared Helena might make. "What kind of challenge?" I asked, dreading the answer. "She's claiming fraud," Richard said bluntly. "Alleging that you manipulated documents and coerced signatures. It's all baseless, of course, but it could tie us up in legal battles for months, maybe years." Lucas slumped in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe she would go this far," he muttered. "Actually, no, I can believe it. This is exactly the kind of thing she would do." I stood up, pacing the length of the study. This could undo everything we had worked for, everything we had sacrificed. But as I turned to face Lucas and Richard, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had come too far to let Helena's desperate gambit derail everything now. "Okay," I said, my voice steady. "Here's what we're going to do. Richard, I need you to compile every piece of documentation we have. Every contract, every email, every scrap of paper that proves the legitimacy of this takeover. We're going to build an ironclad case." Richard nodded, already pulling out his phone to make calls. "Consider it done." I turned to Lucas. "We need to talk to your mother. Together. It's time to end this once and for all." Lucas looked uncertain. "Do you think that's wise? She's not exactly in a reasonable state of mind right now." I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "That's exactly why we need to do this. She needs to see that we're united now. That her old tactics won't work anymore." He studied my face for a long moment before nodding. "You're right. Let's finish this." We found Helena in the mansion's sunroom, surrounded by a sea of papers and looking more disheveled than I had ever seen her. When she saw us enter, her eyes narrowed with a mixture of defiance and fear. "Come to gloat," she spat, her voice hoarse. "To see the great Helena Alencar brought low?" I shook my head, keeping my voice calm. "No, Helena. We've come to talk. This has to stop." She let out a bitter laugh. "Stop? You think I'll just roll over and let you destroy everything my family has built? Never." Lucas stepped forward, his expression pained. "Mom, please. This isn't destroying anything. The company is stronger than ever. Our legacy is secure. Why can't you see that?" Helena's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "Because it's not ours anymore," she cried. "It's hers. She's taken everything from us." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. "Helena," I said softly, "I want you to look at this." I pulled an envelope from my jacket pocket, sliding it across the table to her. With shaking hands, she opened it, her eyes widening as she scanned the contents. What is this?" "It's the deed to a house," I explained. "A beautiful property in Palm Springs. It's yours, if you want it. Along with a very generous monthly allowance." Helena looked up at me, confusion written across her face. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" I sat down across from her, meeting her gaze steadily. "Because despite everything that's happened between us, you're still family. And family takes care of each other." Lucas moved to stand behind me, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. "Mom, Sarah, and I have been talking. We want to move forward, to build something new. But we can't do that with all this anger and resentment hanging over us. We're offering you a chance at a fresh start. Please, take it." Helena looked between us, her expression a mixture of suspicion and hope. "And what's the catch? What do you want from me in return?" I leaned forward, my voice firm but not unkind. "We want you to drop this legal challenge. To accept that things have changed and to let us move forward. Can you do that, Helena?" For a long moment, the room was silent save for the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantel. I could almost see the wheels turning in Helena's head as she weighed her options. Finally, she slumped back in her chair, the fight seeming to drain out of her. "I don't have much choice, do I?" she said quietly. I shook my head. "You always have a choice, Helena. But I'm hoping you'll make the right one. For all of us." She was quiet for another long moment before nodding slowly. "All right," she whispered. "All right. I'll do it. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This was it, the final piece falling into place. I turned to Lucas, seeing my own emotions reflected in his eyes. We had done it. We had navigated this treacherous path and come out the other side, battered but not broken. As Richard was called in to handle the paperwork, I found myself standing by the window, looking out over the sprawling grounds of the Alencar estate. So much had changed in such a short time. The future stretched out before us, full of possibilities and challenges. Lucas joined me, his presence a comforting warmth at my side. "So," he said softly, "what now?" I turned to him, a small smile playing on my lips. "Now, we build. We take this company, this legacy, and we make it into something we can both be proud of. Together." He nodded, reaching out to take my hand. "Together," he repeated, the word carrying the weight of a promise. As we stood there, watching the sun set on one chapter of our lives and rise on another, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, there were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the future. The final move had been made, the game concluded. But in many ways, this was just the beginning. A new board was set, new pieces in play. And this time, we would play as partners, equals in every sense of the word. As I squeezed Lucas's hand, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.